Well, let's pray together. I mean, this is a new experience for me to be on video and Skype and all of that. I've done Skype before, but I've never done video like this. So let's just pray and ask the Lord's presence. Lord, our Heavenly Father, we thank you for the privilege of being in your service. We're humbled that you would choose the likes of us to do the work you want to do on earth. So I pray today that you would fill us with your Spirit and be in all our thoughts and conversations, even our body language. We commit ourselves to you to do the work you've called us for. And I pray in Jesus' name. Amen. Just a word or two of explanation, and then I'll be switching to the PowerPoint presentation. I was born into a Lutheran family. How many of you are Lutherans? Aha. Okay, so I'm among friends. I was born into a Lutheran family, but when I was about 5 or 6 years old, our family moved out into the countryside to a small farm, and we had not been in regular attendance at church. But we moved onto this farm, and on the neighboring farm, there was a Pennsylvania Dutch Christian, a man who lived his world in black and white, as you can imagine. Black car, black hat, black this, white shirt, you know. Anyway, he had a penchant for witnessing to his neighbors. And he went around bothering people with the gospel. And he would take us to Sunday school. He would take us to church. If we would go in the evenings, he'd take us Wednesday evening. He would drive us. And at one point in time, all of my brothers and sisters, and there are 9 of us in the family, plus my parents, we all made professions of faith because of this man. And one thing led to another, and I went off to Bible college, and then I went off to Africa, and I'll talk about that a little bit more when we get to the PowerPoint. Anyway, I came to know the Lord through this Anabaptist group called the Brethren in Christ, and it's with them that I served as missionary in Zambia and Zimbabwe. Now, let me try to switch here, see if we can get this. Now, can you see that? Can you see the PowerPoint? All right, we're going to need the help of Scott here. I think what I need to do is just hang on a minute. I think I know what to do. Screen share. Plus, share screens. Start. Hey Scott, where are we here? What's happening?
We are looking at your desktop, we're looking at your PowerPoint file, and now you just hit play, and now it's perfect.
Okay, well the thing that happened is I forgot to press share screen. So, all right, well now what I would like to do here, I understand we have an hour and a half, and I would like to take the first hour just to run through what we have learned about unhealthy dependency in the Christian movement and how it can be overcome. In fact, I'll talk about how it can be avoided. But so for the first hour, we'll do that. Then we'll open the mic, and you can pass the mic around and ask questions, and we can discuss things together. My experience is that I lived and worked in Central Africa as a missionary during the 1960s, Zambia and Zimbabwe. Our 2 children were born in a mission hospital in Zambia. I learned 2 African languages, one spoken in Zimbabwe, another spoken in Zambia, and I used to preach every Sunday in the Tonga language of Zambia. I went there in 1961. That's quite a long time ago, in fact. That is in the last millennium, not just the last century. And I went to Africa by boat. I am so old that I went to the mission field on a ship. Short-termers don't do that these days, but in those days we did. And we were 18 days on the water between New York and Cape Town. And we were only 6 passengers because we were on a freighter, and we didn't really see land for 18 days. I was only seasick one time, but unfortunately it lasted for 18 days. I was so glad to get off that ship in Cape Town, and needless to say, after being there 2 years, in fact, in those days, short-term mission trips were 2 years. I was there for 2 years, and I decided to fly home because I'm just not a good sailor. Now, that was during the 1960s. During the 1970s, oh, by the way, my wife then joined me after those 2 years, and as I said, our children were born there. In the 1970s, I lived and worked in missionary training at the Fuller School of World Mission in Pasadena. How many of you are familiar with the Fuller School of World Mission? Can I see your hands? Whoa, okay. Well, let me take a minute or two to tell you what was going on there. Dr. Donald McGavin was a missionary to India, and he and Professor Alan Tippett, who had been a missionary in Fiji, they caught on to this concept which they called church growth. And basically, it was an effort to be accountable in the Christian movement to see where God is working and where people are coming to faith. And for many of us as missionaries, we were caught in this thing of not really understanding what was going on around us. I mean, we lived and worked among animistic people in central Zambia, but we did not have training as missionaries to understand what an animistic worldview is all about. Well, when this school opened in the late 1960s and early 70s, missionaries like me who had spent a decade in the mission field, we were desperate for answers to questions that were swirling all around us. And so when we found that there was a school that specialized in this, many of us went there. And hundreds over the years of missionaries went to the School of World Mission at Fuller and got an introduction to the cultural implications of what missionary work is about. And so I did the 2-year program and then stayed on and worked for 6 more years. So what happened is I was assistant to the dean, who was Dr. Arthur Glasser at the time. The original faculty of the School of World Mission, who set up this dynamic thing, and it really was very dynamic in terms of missionary training. That faculty included names that you have probably heard before: Professor Alan Tippett and Charles Kraft and Ralph Winter. He was on the faculty at that time. J. Edwin Orr, the man who wrote so many books on revivals, and R. Pierce Beaver. These were all professors. C. Peter Wagner. They were all professors in the school at that time. So my responsibility was to go to work every day and serve that group. And if you can imagine what a privilege it was. And the dynamic of ideas flying every which way, all day, every day. It was a very dynamic situation. So I lived and worked there most of the 1970s. And then God in His providence led me to this little organization that we founded here in Pennsylvania called World Mission Associates. And since 1983, I've been conducting seminars and consultations on issues of dependency and self-reliance in many parts of the world, mostly in East, Central, and Southern Africa, but not exclusively. I mean, I have gone, for example, to Poland, to Russia, to the Philippines, to Lebanon, to Israel, to West Bank, and all in an effort to raise awareness about this issue of unhealthy dependency in the Christian movement. And it's such an encouraging thing to find that it's not a terminal illness, which will come up on one of my screens here. It's not a terminal illness. Churches don't need to die from it. It can be avoided from the beginning, and it can be overcome where it exists. Our old Professor Tippett used to say, you can't understand missiology apart from biography. In other words, if you know what I lived through in colonial Central Africa, when white people were still in charge of just about everything, if you know what I lived through in those days, you will understand why I'm passionate about this issue today. There are other things that other people are passionate about, but this one can be traced to my experience in Central Africa. By the way, I'm not a medical missionary, but like the Holiday Inn Express says, I did sleep in the Holiday Inn last night. No, I didn't really. But. Now, 3 important facts of life. Unhealthy dependency happens in spite of the best intentions. Well-meaning people are going out into the world. They're trying to do good, and they aren't aware of the fact that their best intentions are not good enough, because those best intentions often result in the people becoming dependent upon those bringing the gospel story to them. Healthy sustainability takes planning, dedication, and altered assumptions, as well as the presence of the Holy Spirit. Now, I'm not saying that God doesn't use people who aren't able to do all these things. He does. But healthy sustainability means planning for it, preparing for it. Spiritual renewal. The American Express ad says, don't go out without it. I believe that at the root of the problem of dependency is the need for spiritual renewal. I believe both poverty and unhealthy dependency have their roots in the lack of true spiritual conversion. When I first caught on to talking about this, I discovered 2 different things about the church in Central Africa. I discovered that they were not sending out missionaries. And I began to wonder, why is this that these people have for so many years received the gospel but haven't sent out their own missionaries? I noticed also that there were not any indigenous missionary training schools anywhere, so they weren't preparing people to go out as missionaries. And when I began to delve into this, I saw that there were a couple of things that might be behind it. And one is the fact that the church was dependent on outsiders and couldn't stand on its own 2 feet, had nothing left over to give to anyone else, so they were in a mere survival mode and dependent upon the next grant for a development project or for a new church building or whatever. But I also discovered that there is a level at which Christian conversion does not take place at a deep enough level for many Christians to send out their own believers. Now you can imagine, if a church doesn't have truly spirit-filled people who are delivered from the old animistic paradigm that they were born into, and if they don't have enough money to survive, they're hardly candidates for sending out their own missionaries to other parts of the world. So these 2 things, I began to work on them, and after a period of time, I put my thoughts, oh, by the way, I did seminars on this issue all over East Central and Southern Africa and some of the other countries I mentioned a while ago. And everywhere I went, I would hear church leaders, Zambians or Zimbabweans, say, tell me a story. They would tell me a story. They would say, Fundis, listen to this. This is what happened to us. And they would tell me some story about how they overcame unhealthy dependency or something. So I become a connoisseur of stories of churches which used to be that way, but have found the secret and no longer are that way. And so one of the things I'll do in a few minutes is share some of those stories, because we are desperate in the missionary movement in East Central and Southern Africa and among the churches for the good news that it doesn't have to be this way. at some point I'll get into this, but there are fatalistic attitudes that make us think that this is the way it is. It will never change. You might as well send money and don't expect it to ever get any better. After all, we have all the money. So you have two forms of fatalism here. The one form says, on the part of the believers who've been reached, we are poor, that's the way we will always be, you may as well help us. On the other hand, you have the Westerners who have a lot of money who say, well, that's the way they are, they're poor, they'll never make it unless we give them money, and God has blessed us with so much, let's just give it to them. Now, these two forms of fatalism are deadly. And what I'm trying to do is raise awareness to the fact that it doesn't have to be that way. Churches don't have to be started with dependency from day one. And they don't have to live with it once they realize it can be overcome. They don't have to live with it forever. So spiritual renewal, I believe, is at the root of it. I have a section, maybe some of you have seen the book that I did. It's called When Charity Destroys Dignity, Overcoming Unhealthy Dependency in the Christian Movement. And I have a chapter in there on three things of importance. And one of them is spiritual renewal. Restructuring is the first, because the Christian movement, when it was introduced in many parts by missionaries, was structured to be dependent upon money from the outside. And so those older institutions, which were very very needy and demanded a lot of resources, they had to be, that restructuring had to happen, because it would be an unfair burden to put on a church in Central Africa all the weight of the programs that the missionaries brought in. But the second is spiritual renewal. And there's I spend a lot of time talking about this. I think this is one of the key issues. If people are not thoroughly converted at the center of the paradigm, at the basic presuppositional level of life, if they're not converted at that level, they will unlikely have a passion to take the Christian faith to someone else. The third thing that I say in that scenario is that there's a lack of imagination. The freedom to do things in an indigenous way was often thwarted by people who came with better ideas and more money. And so in many places where the church could have sprung up and taken off and done dramatic things, that was thwarted by the presence of people with money from the outside. And there are many stories of creativity when people began to look at their own resources and use their own imagination. I'll just as an example, I'll give you just one example at this point. I've been doing seminars in Uganda. And some young pastors there caught on to the importance of what I was saying, and they used their imagination to do some unique things. And one of the things they did is they went out onto the islands of Lake Victoria, and they found two basic populations there. One was those who were in African traditional religion, and those who were Muslim. So they thought, how can we reach these people for Christ? And they started to do secular seminars on how to run a business. Now, I never thought of that as an evangelistic tool, but they did. They started these seminars, and they would slip into the program a session on the Father Heart of God. They would slip into a session on forgiveness. Now, both of these issues ring a bell with people who are either in the African traditional religion or in Islam. And so all I'm saying by that is that that kind of creativity, if it were released across the African continent and people were free to do it, you just look around, you see it happening, but it's so essential that people be able to use their own creativity rather than depend upon someone else. Now, about this session, what I'd like to do here for this first hour is simply to raise awareness about this. I cannot solve, I think I say that right here, since I don't know the conditions where you live and work, I'm hesitant to make specific suggestions. Why do I say that? Because the solution to the problem of unhealthy dependency is going to be different in different places. I will tell a dramatic story after a while at the Presbyterian Church in East Africa, and another about the Assemblies of God in South Africa. Both of those transformations were dramatic, but they were different. Why were they different? Because the cultural situation is different, the political situation is different, the economic situation is different. The spiritual condition of the people is different. The attitude of the people who plant the churches is different. The background. So I cannot say specifically what you should do. I would need to know a lot about the situation in which you are before I could make a specific suggestion. So I hope you understand if I say, well, I don't know enough about the dynamics of where you're living and working in order to know what, to advise you what to do. But if we will begin to work together, learn from each other, pray, and ask for God's direction, I believe there's a solution in every situation which God will bring when the creativity to find out what the Holy Spirit wants to do is found. I will share with you what others have done to avoid or overcome unhealthy dependency. And I would encourage you to become aware of the problem. You'll see evidences of it once you become aware of it. You'll see evidences of it. And then look for someone else who had a similar problem or what they did about it. And maybe your creativity then will be fed by the fact that you have learned what some other missionaries in some other place or some other church leaders have done. Hopefully, the ultimate decision where you live and work will be with those on the local scene. The decision will be on the local scene, not the outsiders who may have contributed to the problem in the first place. One of the things I do, and I have a major section in that book, and by the way, that book is 400 pages of me ruminating around over this issue, so a lot of topics are covered. But one of them is the issue of ownership. And I believe that in many places the gospel seed is sown, and it's just come into being. The ownership, for too long, is retained by the people who have the money to make it happen. Now, once that ownership issue is dealt with, then there comes a time when people say, this church is ours. We can do it. Let me give you an example out of my little repertoire of stories here. There were two Lutheran groups in southern Africa, one in Zambia and one in South Africa, where they had a very serious dependency problem. They depended on money from North America, and the missionaries came to realize this is not right. We should change this. So they set up a scheme to reduce the funding for at 10% a year. And so they figured that if you get $100,000 a year now from North America, next year you will only get $90,000, and then $80,000, and then $70,000, and eventually, after 10 years, you will be off the support scheme. Well, now, in both of these cases, after 3 years, both the two different unrelated Lutheran groups, and in both of those cases, in year 3, the church leaders said, why do we have to wait 10 years to take responsibility for our church? Why don't we do it now and just stop the money from coming? Now, I maintain that what happened on that occasion was the transfer of psychological ownership, that it was no longer dependent upon people from overseas. You could do things without referring to them, without for them to come. And so the ownership issue is what I think the most critical here. Because without that transfer of ownership, it will, I notice that church leaders in Africa will sit back and watch as long as somebody is willing to put the funding in from the outside. They will sit back and let it happen because it's an easier way to get resources. But I'm convinced that once psychological ownership transfers, that sitting around and waiting for someone else to do it is not necessary. Now, let me give a couple of reactions that people have to the kind of things that I'm saying. Some people know how to avoid this problem instinctively. There's a church in West Africa, Church of Pentecost based in Ghana and surrounding area. They've started 4,000 congregations at least. And somehow or another, they knew from the beginning how to do this without creating dependency. Some people can't help themselves. Their human nature is coupled with good intentions, and they just can't do anything about it. And voila, it's there. Dependency is on the scene. Their compassion drives them. It's kind of a donor mentality or a donor-driven missiology, which they just don't. That's all they can do. Some are frustrated by the problem, but they don't know what it is or what to do about it. Now, one of the people that this happened to, and he tells this story himself, is a missionary by the name of Steve Saint. Steve Saint is the son of one of the 5 missionaries that were killed in 1956 in Ecuador. Steve was there as a teenager. He lived among the Warani people, and then when he left, his Aunt Rachel stayed on behind, and so on, and Betty Elliott. But he left and went to Wheaton to college, and he did some rather dramatic things. He got involved in business, and he made a very good. He was a very good businessman. But God began to speak to him in the 1990s and early 2000 about going back to these people. When he went back to them, excuse me. When he went back to them, he saw something that he hadn't seen before. He saw that these people were kind of paralyzed in their understanding of Christian growth and the building of the church. And it was eating at him. He didn't know exactly what it was, but it was disheartening, whatever it was. So one day he went out to the edge of the jungle to a place called Shelmara, and he was talking with a medical doctor about his disillusionment with what he saw going on among the Warani, because they couldn't do anything for themselves. They couldn't have a conference unless some group came from North America to help them. Couldn't build a building without help from outside. But anyway, this was eating at him, and he went to this medical doctor at Shelmar and said, was telling him the story. And the doctor gave him a copy of Mission Frontiers magazine, which is produced by the U.S. Center for World Mission, and gave him a copy of it, and the whole issue was on dependency. Excuse me while my throat's getting a little scratchy here. Pardon me. gave him this magazine, and Steve read it and said, "This is it. This is the sickness that I'm seeing among these people, this unhealthy dependency." And so he began to do things which resulted in him writing one or two books, including one called The Great Omission, which is really basically about dependency. Now, I say that to say that Steve Saint was one of those people who got frustrated, didn't know what to do about it, and then discovered that, hey, this is real. This is a sickness, and in fact, it has a name. And there are people who have thought about it. Those of us writing on the subject, we were actually confirming the suspicions that they had that there was something wrong. But I always attempt to make sure that we don't get stuck in just analyzing it, because overcoming unhealthy dependency is not an end in itself. The real purpose is sending out missionaries, and to see the church stand on its own 2 feet, produce its own evangelists, and send out its own missionaries. That's the real goal. So we don't want to get sidetracked at any point along the way. Some people become vivid advocates for overcoming unhealth. There are a couple of Lutheran men that I could tell you about who, when they began to understand what was going on, they also realized that something could be done about it. And when they tried new and different things, things began to change. And so I say some who, when they hear about this, they become advocates for overcoming it. Some rationalize that there's nothing wrong with it. We are rich, they are poor, so why not just let it carry on? But the good news is, excuse me, I'm sorry about my throat here for a moment. The good news is that it does not need to be considered a terminal illness. Churches don't have to die from it. They can change. Churches can change. Mission societies can change. One of the things that I think may have to happen in many places before the church realizes its own selfhood is that the mission that planted those churches has to go through the transformation themselves. I have a beginning caution here when I talk about this, and it's this: be careful not to assume that people have nothing to give back to God. In the New Testament, there's a story of the Macedonians in 2 Corinthians chapter 8. I guess I won't take time to turn to it. Well, no, I will. In 2 Corinthians chapter 8, the Apostle Paul is writing a letter to the Corinthians, and he's using these Macedonians as an example. He's holding them up as an example. And he's saying to the Corinthians, I want you to see what God is doing among those Macedonians. And I'm saying by this that it reminds me of the story of the rooster that found an ostrich egg. And he rolled the ostrich egg over to the hen house, and he called the hens over to look at it, and he said to the hens, I just want you to see what they're doing in other places. Well, that's what Paul was doing here. He was holding these Macedonians up as an example. Now, what was he doing there? He was taking a collection on the mission field to send to the mother church in Jerusalem. An offering collected among the Macedonians to take to the mother church in Jerusalem because they were having a drought. Now, let me say before we look at this that I cannot see any place in the New Testament where money goes from the mother church to the mission church. There are examples like Antioch and so on, where the mother church sent money to the missionary, Paul, they supported Paul. But there's no evidence anywhere that I can see that in the church planting of the New Testament, that money went from the mother churches to the mission churches. Now, how was that even possible? Well, for one thing, they didn't have expensive structures, they didn't have pastors' salaries, and all those things which have become so commonplace with us. In terms of the Apostle Paul getting money from those churches, he didn't like it, actually. He said, on one occasion, he said, I would rather die than have someone pay me for preaching the gospel. You remember that. And part of his rationale was there were people going around getting paid to preach, and that they were not really, truly born-again people. He had names for them. In fact, I think one of the Greek words could be translated hucksters. They were hucksters going around preaching and getting paid for it. So there's a sense in which when you look at the New Testament, you can pretty well eliminate the role of money in church planting to do all that was done by the early church leaders. Money was not the central issue, as often seems to be with us today. But let's look at this 2 Corinthians chapter 8. Paul says, beginning at the beginning of the verse, and now, brothers, the Corinthians, we want you to know about the grace that God has given the Macedonian churches. Out of severe trial, their overflowing joy and their extreme poverty welled up in rich generosity. The Apostle Paul was taking a collection among people who were in severe trial and extreme poverty. How many of you have actually thought that the ideal place to go to take a collection is among those who are in severe trial and extreme poverty? Any hands? I don't see any hands. No. That's where the Apostle Paul went. He took this collection. Now let's look at what was going on. These obviously were not wealthy people. These Macedonians were not wealthy people. They were in extreme poverty. He says in verse 3, I testify that they gave as much as they were able, and even beyond their ability. Entirely on their own, they urgently pleaded with us for the privilege of sharing in this. These people in Macedonia were beggars, but service to the saints. You notice what they were begging for. They were begging for the privilege of giving. That's the kind of beggars they were. He says in verse 8, and they did not do as we expected, but they gave themselves first to the Lord and then to us in keeping with God's will. And I believe in that verse right there, you see the thing that I was talking about a while ago. They gave themselves first to the Lord and then to us in this project. That, to me, shows that spiritual renewal was foundational. They gave themselves first to the Lord. I was doing a seminar in Lusaka, Zambia here several years back, and a young pastor stood up and said, Mfundisi, I don't know what to do. He said, the people in my church, they don't give. In fact, he said, they don't even know the Lord. And I said, are you expecting people who don't know the Lord to joyfully put money in the church collection? You see, his challenge was not to teach Christian stewardship at that point. His challenge was to introduce people to Jesus. And that's what comes to mind when I read this. They gave themselves first to the Lord. Now, there's much more in that chapter, and I wish I had more time to talk about it. But in fact, one of the things that it comes to is the issue of accountability. How do you actually get the money from Macedonia to Jerusalem? And so there's the last part of chapter 8 is about choosing Titus to accompany the money. Two people should carry the money. One of the problems we've had in our missionary work is the whole idea of secrecy. There was so much money, we didn't know where. If I were an African church leader, I would see the evidence of the money, but I didn't know how much came. I didn't know who accounted for it, and it was a mystery. And this idea of having more than one person who knows and understands and protects God's money is just fundamental to overcoming the unhealthy dependency. Well, I won't take more time on that except to say this. The assumptions with which we begin will most likely determine whether dependency develops. Assumptions. These basic assumptions at the core of who we are and what we think. Those basic assumptions will determine where we end up. I sometimes use the illustration of these roundabouts. I don't know if you have them in your part of the country, but we used to have more of them here in Pennsylvania, and actually now they're coming back. But these are the circles where you drive in, and once you're in the circle, you have the right of way, but you yield the right of way until you get in. In England, there are many of them. In Africa, there are many of them. But once you get in that circle, there are options for getting out of it. One road goes this way, another road goes that way, another road goes another way. And where you end up is determined by which choice you make. By the way, I've seen these roundabouts with not just 4 roads crossing each other, but 6 or 8. In fact, there are double roundabouts near Heathrow Airport where there must be 10 or more options. But what I choose as an option will determine where I'm going. And I think that's the way it is with this. And so if we believe people are too poor to give anything back to God, we'll probably be right. For example, we might assume that people are poor because they appear to us to be poor. Now there's an assumption for you. I think that many short-term teams that are going out are going to places where people do not live in abject poverty. I think I have this. Let me just pull it up here. The assumption is based on 2 kinds of poverty: relative poverty and absolute poverty. Relative poverty means these people do not have as much as I have, where I come from. But they do have enough to survive. They can put their children in school and so on. But maybe they don't have running water in their house, or maybe they don't have electricity. So compared to me, they're poor. But it's only relative poverty. Now, abject poverty or absolute poverty is poverty which people will not survive unless they're helped. And we need to make a distinction between these two, because if we treat people in relative poverty as if they live in absolute poverty and will not survive, then we are sowing the seeds for dependency among them. And so that's why I feel that this whole issue of assumptions, there's much more I could say about that, but I want to move on. Now, let me tell you a few stories, just to give you an idea of what can happen when the creativity of self-reliance thinking is released. And here's my first example comes from South Africa. It's one of the Pentecostal groups called Assemblies of God. Now, there are 3 different Assemblies of God denominations in South Africa. This particular one they often refer to as the Black Assemblies of God. And they had a senior minister by the name of Nicholas Bangu who came to America to get money every year. He would go around to mission societies and churches, and he would collect money because the people where he that in his church in South Africa, they were poor. They couldn't afford to even care for themselves, let alone pay for their church. So he needed to get money from overseas to have that happen. But on one occasion, while he was here in North America, God spoke to him and said, don't ask these people for money. Go back home and get the money from your own people. Now, being a Pentecostal, he was one of these people who had a speaking relationship with the Lord. He would speak, then he would listen. And he would speak, and then he would listen. And the Lord guided him through this thing. Just as an aside, I think sometimes we do not say, speak, Lord, your servant is listening. We say, listen, Lord, your servant is speaking. But anyway, he said to the Lord, the Lord said to him, go back home and get the money from your own people. And he said, but Lord, in my church, all I have are unemployed women and children. Is that where you expect me to get the money? And the Lord said, yes, that's where you go to get the money. How many of you have actually thought that the ideal place to go to get money for the church is among unemployed women and children? Any? Hey, somebody there must have read about this or something. Yeah. So he said to the Lord, okay, if that's what I'm supposed to do, I'll do it. And he went back home, and the Lord told him 4 things. Do these 4 things. Teach those women how to care for their families. Teach them how to evangelize their husbands. Teach them to make something with their hands so they can earn a living. And number 4, teach them to give something back to God in thanksgiving. In other words, teach them to tithe. So he did this, and he introduced these 4 concepts. And they did evangelize their husbands. There are now men in those churches. I can tell you by experience, there are men in those churches. But he taught the women, make something with your hands. He said to them, now, while you're making dresses, if you make 10 dresses, and you just remember, one of them is for the Lord. It's your tithe. It's not yours. It belongs to the Lord. If you make grass mats and you're sewing grass mats, remember while you're sewing that if you make 20, 2 are for the Lord, and so on like that. So that stewardship was built into the earning process. There was a consciousness of the work I'm doing, some of it here belongs to the Lord. It's not just mine. Well, so successful was this transformation that this church began a conference in a little town called Tabanchu. Are any of you familiar with South Africa? Anyone know ever hear of Tabanchu? It's reputed to be the birthplace of the Tswana people. Anyway, they go there for a weekend conference. And the last report I heard is they took a collection. And by the way, they don't take a collection in ordinary plates or these velvet bags with a little hole in the top, you know. They don't use those. They use bathtubs. These tubs, which are about 36 inches across, and they're metal tubs which are used in the villages, and maybe 24 inches wide, they take the collection in bathtubs. And the last time they did that, the collection amounted to over 15 million South African rand, which is over 2 million US dollars, from a church of unemployed women and children. Imagine the transformation that took place when they began to care for their families, evangelize their husbands, make something with their hands, and give something back to God. If I'm doing a seminar anywhere in Southern Africa, and there are people in the seminar from that church, I can tell it immediately because they are smiling from ear to ear. I actually spoke at an African congregation in London. There were 70 or 80 people in the room. And I was speaking there, and I mentioned the name of Reverend Bangu. As soon as I mentioned his name, some women in the back row of the church were smiling. And I saw this, and I wondered whether there was any chance that they were from that church. And just then the pastor on the platform behind me, he pulled on my coat, and he said, "Glenn, those people back there are from Reverend Bangu's church." So I talked to one of the women afterward, and she said, "Oh, yes, that's the way Reverend Bangu was. He taught us to tithe." Now, that means that there are people going out from that church in South Africa who are smiling all the way to London. And this is the transformation that I'm talking about that is possible, that people do not need to live in a dependency state for all of their lives. The Presbyterian Church in East Africa was dependent upon money from Scotland. And in the early 1970s, late 60s, early 70s, they elected a moderator by the name of John to be their moderator. And he discovered that this church didn't even have enough money to pay the moderator's salary. So he said, "What kind of church is this which can't pay its own moderator?" So he decided it was a dependency mentality on the part of these Kikuyu believers in Kenya. So he sent a message to the mission and said, "Don't send us any money for 5 years. Don't send us any more missionaries for 5 years. And especially don't make any decisions for us for 5 years. We want to see if we can get this church on its own 2 feet." Well, it wasn't long after taking that bold stand, for which he was greatly criticized, I should say, by Western missionaries who said, "Oh yes, he's anti-missionary." No, he was anti-dependency. He wasn't anti-missionary, he was anti-dependency. Anyway, they soon began to pay their own pastors, buy vehicles for the pastors, build their own church buildings. They even started a pension fund for their pastors, something they had been told could not be done. They did all of these, and then, after this period of time, they discovered that there were homeless children on the streets of Edinburgh, Scotland, the city from which their money always came. And these Kikuyu Christians said, "We should do something to say thank you to the missionaries who brought us the gospel. Let's take a collection for that children's home that's looking after those street children." And they collected 200,000 Kenya shillings in a collection for something in the mother church. Have you ever heard of money going from the mission field to the mother church? Yes, you see it in the New Testament and you see it here. Money went to the, and 200,000 Kenya shillings, I calculated that at the time it was about $30,000. The same people who could not afford to pay their moderator found that they had resources enough to give. Let me continue on. I was in Lome, Togo recently, and I was doing some teaching, and one young man stood up and said, "Let me tell you our story." He said, "I come from Cameroon, and we had a project to evangelize about 30 villages. So we sat down as church leaders and we made a budget, and we knew it was going to be expensive. So we made this budget, and it came to, in CFA francs, he said it came to 100,000 US dollars. And he said, I, for one, said, that's too much. We can't do that. But one of his colleagues said, no, wait a minute. why don't we try something new? Let's ask people to bring whatever they can afford. If they can afford to bring an egg, let them bring an egg. If they can afford to bring a chicken, let them bring a chicken. If they can afford to bring a cow, let them bring a cow. It reminds me of that chapter 8 of 2 Corinthians, where down further beyond where I was reading, it says they were each giving according to their means, an egg, a chicken, a cow. So he said the man who made that suggestion convinced the rest of us that this is what we should do. We should launch a project and see if we can raise this money. And he said, in the end, we not only reached the $100,000 worth of CFA francs, but we exceeded it and had enough money left over and above the $100,000 to buy a four-wheel drive vehicle for the project, something that wasn't even in the budget. Now, this idea of how something like that can happen, it goes back to this assumption business that I was talking about. The first man made the assumption, it's too much, it can't be done. The second man said, no, wait a minute. And here's where the release of local creativity came in. Wait a minute, let's try. And so you had the assumptions of one man said, it can't be done. The other man said, yes, let's try. I heard about a medical team that went to Turkey. In fact, a man that was leading the team actually told me the story. They were only there for like 2 weeks, but while they were there, one of the women in the church, a wife of one of the church leaders, developed serious back problem of some kind. And the doctor said it needs a certain kind of surgery, and of course it's going to be very expensive. It was going to cost like $5,000. And so this head of this a medical team from North America was telling me, he said, well, the first thing we did as a team is we asked, what should our role be? How much should we give toward this $5,000? But he said, every time I thought about it, the Holy Spirit seemed to say to me, no, wait, don't do anything. Well, what he did is he talked to his colleagues, and they decided that if they needed to, they could give $700 toward that $5,000. But the point that the Lord was making to him was, wait, don't do anything now. He waited, and the local people contributed the entire $5,000 necessary for that. And the money that the short-term team was carrying was not required. Now, it takes some kind of maturity to say that that was better for the church than if they had given their money. Because what happens here is we get such a good feeling from giving that we want to be in this with the central figures, and we want to be able to go back home to America and say, they needed money and we gave this much, and so on like that. Now, I'm simply saying that the privilege of local people, begging for the privilege of giving, as in 2 Corinthians chapter 8, it's a real thing. Do you know about the church in China? 1951, the bamboo curtain was put in place. Missionaries were forced out. Some missionaries were killed. Some went into internment camps. But all missionaries had to leave China. They left behind about 1 million believers, more or less, because many of them were in unregistered churches, and so getting accurate figures was difficult. But they left about 1 million believers behind when the missionaries left. 30 years later, by 1980, 81, along there, the 1 million believers in China had grown to 50 million, with no money coming in from the outside, no missionaries from the outside, they were given a gift by the missionaries during the years that the church was being planted. And the gift they were given was a 3-point principle. By the way, when am I supposed to stop and okay, so we do have a little bit of time. Okay, just whenever it's time, somebody stand up and wave your arms. I have a little thing about 1.25 inches square in the corner of my monitor that I can see. Anyway, the Chinese people were given a 3-point principle, and it was this: that churches that we plant should be able to support themselves, self-supporting churches. They should also be able to govern themselves. They should make their own decisions for themselves. And third, they should be able to reproduce themselves. Now, when the church had those 3 principles, and all missionaries and all money were removed, they had those self-supporting, self-governing, self-propagating principles to go on. And that's how the church could grow from 1 million to 50 million. By the way, it's grown even much further than that. The latest figures I've heard are somewhere in the range of 120 million now. It's grown rapidly. Money was not the secret to the growth of the church in China. At least not outside money. Now, we look at this and we say, well, what should we do something like that in other places? A little later on, I'll try to get around to the ways that the things that precipitate the move towards self-reliance. And in this particular case, no missionary had a strategy of saying we will be out of here in the next 5 years or 10 years or whatever. No, this was a decision prompted by the Holy Spirit that caused people to, caused the missionaries to leave. Nobody had any choice in it. Now suppose, for example, that the missionaries had introduced the idea of partnership. Oh, there's a buzzword for today, partnership. Supposing they had introduced the idea that every church in Yunnan province needs to have a wealthy church in America that they are partners with, and the people in America, since they're rich, they could send money to the church in Yunnan province and so on like that. And what you need is partnership. Supposing they had developed 1,000 churches with partners in North America, and then the bamboo curtain goes into place. And the money stops. You can't get money in, you can't get missionaries in. No. The future, when the church is dependent upon resources from the outside, is bleak for the church that is dependent. Now, I'll just keep moving on. I'm going to skip this part because this part about ownership, I mentioned it a little earlier, but let's see what else I have here. I want to talk about some hospitals. Let me see here once. Let's look at a few places where Christian hospitals moved in the direction of local support. Where in the world is Tumu Tumu? Has anyone in the room ever heard of Tumu Tumu? Okay, let me tell you about it. Tumu Tumu is a Christian hospital in Kenya, about 150 kilometers from Nairobi. It was run by the Presbyterian Church, which I mentioned a while ago, and they received money from Scotland, and that's how the hospital was funded. However, the people in Scotland developed a sort of fatigue. I call it donor fatigue. And they suggested to the people in Kenya, just close the hospital because we're tired of doing it. It's not meeting the spirit spiritual needs the way we thought it would, or whatever their reasons were, just close it. We're not going to fund it anymore. Now here you had some Kenyans who said, wait a minute, how can people so far away tell us to close a hospital? Why don't you let us take it over and see what we can do with it? So the local people took things into their own hands. The result, Tumu Hospital was saved. Let me tell you the story. They went back, these local people. By the way, this is a clear example of local creativity being released. These local leaders at Tumu Hospital, medical people and so on, went back to Nairobi, to a suburb of Nairobi called Kikuyu, which is an area, so it's also the name of a major people group. They went back to Kikuyu, 150 kilometers away. They formed a team which had medical people and pastors, and they began a march from Kikuyu to Tumu. And they marched every day. They marched, and in the evenings they would have prayers. The pastors would lead a village, the nearby village, in prayers. They would maybe have a little clinic for some medical people on the team. But as they marched, people would say to them, "Oh, why are you marching? What's going on here?" And they said, "No, we're trying to save our hospital. Help us, help us." So they marched all the way to Tumu. They took over the hospital. They refurbished it. They painted it. They added new facilities. They made decisions which no one on the missionary side had ever thought of before. Let me tell you about some of them. One of them was related to the latrines. They said the latrines here should be so clean. And if you know anything about latrines in some parts of the world, they're not the cleanest place. But their theory was, their directive was, that the latrines should be clean enough that you could eat a meal inside. Now, I never, and a white person should not be saying that sort of thing. But these local people, they set up the rules. They set up rules about drinking. And they said there will be no drinking by the hospital staff, and they lost 3 staff immediately as a result of that. So thorough was the transformation of Tumu that they actually became a showcase for other hospitals to come and look at. They went from like 5% local income in Tumu to 95% local income in Tumu. That's how radical the transformation was. And so other hospital staff would come and look at it and say, well, how did you do this? They were using it as a showcase. Tumu was saved. By the way, this story is available if you look on our website, and you have our website information on the end of the handouts. But if you look for the transformation of Tumu Hospital, it was written by the head of the Christian Health Association of Kenya. Now, where in the world is Clinica Biblica? Has anyone heard about this place? Clinica Biblica? Okay, and see any hands? This is a hospital in Costa Rica. Clinica Biblica is a former mission hospital in San Jose, Costa Rica. It suffered from mission fatigue. Here's where the mission said, this hospital is not meeting the spiritual needs that we thought it was going to as an evangelistic point. Close it. The Latin American mission just got tired of sending money and it wasn't working. They said, close it. Here again, some local people said, wait a minute. Let us have a chance. Let us take it over. And so some medical doctors put together a plan for taking over the hospital. Now, it was started in 1929, and it was threatened with closure in the 1960s. And along came these local people who said, give us a chance. And during this process, the next few years, ownership transferred. I was talking earlier about psychological ownership. When local people said, let us try, we can do it, give us a chance, that's a sign that transfer of psychological ownership is underway. So they transferred the ownership, and Clinica Biblica was saved. But more than that, several years ago, they launched a $23 million addition. I'm telling you these stories because I'm trying to show that this, as I said earlier, is not dependency. Unhealthy dependency is not a terminal illness. Churches can be delivered from it. Hospitals can be delivered from it. Some time ago, I was at a medical conference down in Louisville. There's a big conference there every year at one of the churches. 2,500 people come. And I've been doing seminars there off and on over the years. And last time I was there, a man saw me standing in the lobby. I was waiting to go to the airport, and he said, he came over to me, he said, you don't know who I am. But he said, I'm a medical doctor. And he said, my wife and I were working in a hospital in Ghana. And the hospital was dependent upon us as Americans, and it was dependent on money that we were bringing in from America. He said, somebody recommended that we get some material on dependency, and this was a video series that we had produced, which is still available, and it's on DVD now, but he said, we got this video series on dependency, and my wife and I sat and watched it. Now, it's an 8-hour video series, so they get a medal for endurance. But anyway, they watched it, and when they finished looking at this 8 hours on dependency, the husband and wife turned to each other and said, what should we be doing differently in this hospital based on what we learned about dependency? And then he said, that was 10 years ago. And today that hospital is 100% funded with local resources and 100% staffed by Ghanaian people. And so I use it as an illustration to show that it is not necessary for churches to die from this. Let me make a couple of observations on this Clinica Biblica. Some people were skeptical of local sustainability. And I'm saying here, those who are skeptical will find things to criticize. You can always find something to criticize. But the fact that it is still there, it is growing, and is meeting needs is an undisputed fact. They were returning as much as 40% of their profit to the community. How can they do that? When other hospitals can't get enough to survive on, they have 40% to return to the community. And some people say, well, Clinica Biblica overcharges the rich to help the poor. You know, that's Robin Hooding. Or the technical term in medical missions, I understand, is crossover income. They call it crossover income. Some say that the evangelistic fervor in the hospital has been diminished. You see, you're looking for things about which to be critical. But others say being a poor mission hospital is no guarantee that spiritual emphasis will be strong. So these are just a few of the comments that came out of my discussion with the people from Clinica Biblica. By the way, I made this observation that Clinica Biblica is no longer draining mission funds intended for evangelism. No, I think I better stop. Let me see. Oh, I must tell you about Vanga Hospital. Vanga Hospital in West Africa, in the northwest corner of Congo, was run by a man by the name of Dan Fountain. Does anyone in the room know the name Dan Fountain? Okay, there's one hand went up. Dan Fountain was for 35 years the chief medical officer at Vanga Hospital. And they were bringing sick people in and treating them at the hospital, but very little was being done to prevent people from getting sick. And this grew on Dan. And it was brought to his attention most dramatically one day when there was a young lad that came in and had an obvious infestation of worms in the digestive system. And he removed the worms, and the boy regained his health, and he sent him back home. 6 months later, the boy came back with more worms. And Dan got alone in prayer and said, Lord, I can't do this. What's happening here? Look, I did this one time, and now it's happened again. What should I do? I love Dan's response in his conversation with the Lord. The Lord said to him, go and lay hands on the boy, but be sure you have a scalpel in your hand. And so Dan did the second operation to remove the worms. But then he began to ask the question, what is anyone doing about the prevalence of this in the villages? So they started some village health clinics, and they got to the point where they had 50 village health clinics, which were trying to help people avoid becoming sick in the first place. So the hospital, Vanga Hospital, became a training place to train village health workers who would go back out into those villages. And so successful was it, their effort, that the government came along and said, look, we have village health clinics throughout this area, but we're not managing them very well. Would you consider taking them over? One of Dan's observations is that curing should be close to where curing is needed. Rural clinics can be funded and built with local resources. Rural clinics take the pressure off the medical staff in large hospitals, and the cost of overhead is considerably lower in rural clinics compared to large hospitals. Medical professionals who visit rural clinics see illness in context, including sanitation, nutrition, and so on. Well, I will say something about Dan Fountain. The Lord took him home about a year ago. He had 35 years in the Vanga Hospital. Then he's worked for MAP International, and he's had an international ministry, running seminars in many, many places. He has a burden to teach missionaries about preventive health care, not just curative, but he passed away about a year ago. Now, there's a small group, and it's my privilege to be part of it, but there's a small group that is strategizing the establishment of a school for intercultural health care, the Dan Fountain School for Intercultural Health Care, something like that. And we just had a meeting this past week with an institution that we may be able to sidle up to and bring it in under that umbrella. So if any of you are at all interested in that, get in touch with me. I'll put you in touch with the person who's coordinating the effort. But the idea is to get whole person health care, not just curative when you see the symptoms, but to prevent the illness in the first place. And God has used Dan Fountain to inspire many medical people. And if you have medical people who want to learn, Dan has books. Google his name on, and you'll find that he's probably half a dozen or more books that he's written about, including issues of sanitation and caring for the land and so on and so on. Okay, well, I'm going to stop there. There's much more I could do. Oh, there it is. Learn about Vanga Hospital. Read anything written by Dan Fountain.
So, any questions, comments you want to share from the group?
I'm sorry. Now I'm getting an echo of some kind from that microphone. Are you close enough to it?
Yeah.
Let's try it. Okay, go ahead.
Go ahead, Sylvie.
I was wondering about
I'm not hearing anything now.
can movement from dependency be prompted from an outsider? So, I'm thinking particularly of our companion center in Northeast India, and know the situation a little bit, in a small way from a couple visits there, and particularly in connection with one of the hospitals, one of the two main hospitals, one in a viable, very healthy situation, and one in an unhealthy situation. And GHM is very, very interested, has visited there, is very interested in helping them with some of their projects and et cetera. The problem is that the other hospital in the poor management situation probably needs greater help, but it's at this point like pouring water in a hole or whatever. So how can we prompt that church to think in terms of some healthier ways to manage and move forward, or does that have to come from them?
One of the things I didn't mention is the role of the church and the role of prayer in dealing with what looked like impossible situations. And I'll just say this for what it's worth, because I don't know enough about that hospital situation to really be definitive, but I was in Mozambique, and a young pastor stood up and said, "Let me tell you what happened in our area. We had unemployed people, and we decided to start a prayer meeting for the unemployed." And he said, Monday, Wednesday, and Friday at 5 p.m., we gathered to pray for the unemployed. Now, I never heard of North America, our government in the United States, announcing a prayer meeting to deal with unemployment issues, but that's what this church leader was led to do. It wasn't very long until things had changed, and people became employed, and they were producing more things than they could sell. So they called the church together and said, we've been praying for the unemployed. Now God has blessed us with products, but we don't have any way to get them to market. So there's some businessmen in the church who said, now wait a minute, we have big trucks, and every week we go into Maputo, the capital city, and we load up things and bring them out and we deliver them to the rural shops. But he said every week going into Maputo, we go in empty. We'll carry the products you have to the city, to the capital city. So here you had people get down on their knees to look for a solution to the problem of unemployment. God not only blessed them with employment, He blessed their hands, and He provided a way to get the product to the city. Now, this may seem like a simplistic approach to it, but I believe if there are Christian church leaders and Christian hospital staff who will come together and make it a priority to pray and ask for God's direction, I believe it's possible to work through things like that. That's a very inadequate answer to your question, but it's what comes to mind when. Okay?
Randy.
Thank you, Pastor Glenn, for really thought-provoking things. But so I have kind of a question, and it's actually some help. So, how do you? What advice do you have for me to help prevent me from developing, I guess, what I would call a holier-than-thou attitude? If I start to think of my mission partners as people who are lacking spiritual gifts or true spirituality, if they develop dependency. I'm afraid that I might start to develop a kind of a holier-than-thou attitude. Do you have advice for me about how to kind of deal with that?
Whoa. Quite a question. Uh, are you referring to the fact that when you start down this road, you have colleagues who will criticize you? Is that what you're saying?
No, not necessarily. I'm just kind of trying to deal with my own thoughts about, well, gosh, if the development of dependency is a problem with my mission partners having, not true spiritual faith, I think to myself, gosh, am I one to judge or what,
Well, when I'll just give you a word of personal testimony. Um, I went to Africa and encountered all these issues and didn't know what I was up against. And but eventually, as time went along, it became more and more clear to me that we had a dynamic going on in the colonial mission period, which was clearly an adversarial relationship with people in the churches. I'm sorry to say that, and it sounds very critical. But it's true that when we were making all the decisions, we had so much money available to us, people were becoming offended by the things we did. And I got to the point where I decided that I did not want to be party to the things that were causing those kinds of problems. So I made a decision to change my psychological residence. That's what I call it. And I moved into the frame of reference of the local people. And what happened is the stories that were told about us versus them all of a sudden took on a new meaning because I was actually with the them. I was in the them category. So when they told stories about those people and they don't do this and they don't do that and so on, they were talking about me because that's where my psychological resonance was. Now, I allowed that to, it grew. It grew significantly, and I don't have regret at all making the decision to go that way. But what happened to me was I became, I think you used the word self-righteous, but I became bitter. And I decided that there was something going on inside of me that was causing me anxiety and pain, and it needed to be dealt with. And God in His providence brought along someone who said to me, Glenn, I believe you're struggling with something, aren't you? I said, yeah, I sure am. He said, well, if you would like to be helped, I'm willing to help you. I said to my friend Joe, Joe, I'll do whatever's necessary. You tell me what to do because I can't go on like this. So he said, well, you get a pencil and notepad and you come to my house this, 4 o'clock this afternoon and I'll talk to you. So I went to Joe's place and he talked to me about these inner conflicts that I was having and how I wasn't handling them very well. And for an hour, he didn't make me say anything. I just wrote down everything he said. And he didn't make me talk or anything. And when we finished, he said, that's all for today. Just come back tomorrow at 4 o'clock. So I went back the next day, another whole hour of me writing things down. And this went on for 22 days. That I went and sat and listened to him talk about the end result of an attitude that isn't right within me. And so in the end, I went to my wife and I said, by the way, I said to her, my friend Joe, he says I have a problem. She says, what kind of problem do you have? I said, well, Joe says I have unresolved inner conflicts. Oh, what are you supposed to do about it? She said. And I said, well, Joe says I'm supposed to forgive the people that I feel offended me. Wow, that sounds like a blast from outer space. Anyway, the result was that I just took it seriously, and I said, okay, Lord, I'm going to fix this as best I can. And I wrote letters to a few people, probably, I don't know, 12, 15 letters, and said to them, I'm sorry for the things I allowed to happen in my life, and I'd like to just have a fresh start to our relationship. And God wonderfully helped me. The stress level that I felt with actually physical ramifications, they disappeared. I mean, I just can't say anything other than the fact that the Lord used it, and that's how I dealt with it, and that's how I got through it. It's I would need to know more about your situation to give. I mean, this kind of off the cuff sort of thing. There must be much more to your situation than I gathered to this phone conversation. But I don't know if that's helpful or not.
Dave Thompson. I've spent considerable time working with a mission group in a church in Chad and Cameroon. And now I find myself advising a church via long distance, brief visits. It's very, very difficult to do the kind of thing you're talking about, Randy, in these short-term visits. I think the key is during those visits, if we have to do things this way, is to pray that God would bring people into our lives who can help us, who can understand us, whom we can relate to, whom we can share our burdens with in a way that does not make us holier than thou, but makes us partners in ministry. I remember a moment in my own ministry in Chad. I came back after 10 years. And the nurse who I trained took me out into the hills. Cried.
You have a train going by? Well, it's what it sounded like to me, but okay.
Anyway, he was very discouraged. There were conflicts going on in the program, all sorts of bad things. And he finally told me in French, I just feel like je ne suis qu'un petit nègre. I'm nothing but a little nigger. He was a black African nurse who was replacing a white missionary doctor. But we had a relationship. And over time, the biggest thing was that God did a wonderful work of transformation in his life, where he became a respected leader. But I guess the message I would just like to leave is that in our short-term relationships, there's a crucial need to develop relationships with a few people who can transmit some of our concerns and from whom we can learn.
Let me just make an observation on the short-term thing that you're talking about. I've come to believe that my role today is better off being short-term than long-term. Now, if God called me to work again among the Tonga people in Zambia, I would be open to that, and I guess I should say I was never happier in Christian ministry than when I was going from village to village and sitting with pastors, but that's because I lived and worked there. Now that I'm seeing this need for transformation or transitioning, what I do is I pay a visit and I say to the church leaders, how are things going for you? Tell me about your joys, your sorrows, how we can pray together, how we can pray for each other. And you're the most important person here, not me. I'm only here to encourage you. And so after a few days of listening like that, maybe a week, I'm gone again. But there's no, I do not want a dependency situation to develop where they can only do anything when I'm there. See, so I'm purposely attempting to transfer this passion to other people. And I can honestly say it is really more rewarding to be these days to see these church leaders doing things which for example, in the eastern Zambia right now, I've just gone in and out of there maybe a half a dozen times over the last few years. And as a result of my going in and out, they decided that they ought to do something about a missionary emphasis in their churches in eastern Zambia. So they're having a missions fest coming up in July. And I'm not there to plan it, to fund it, or anything. It's a result of my inspiring them to do this sort of thing. So they're doing it, and they've invited me to come. Okay, so I can go and I can spend a little bit of time there as long as I'm not the featured speaker and all of that. I don't want that. I want them to be the featured speakers. Maybe I'll give a testimony or something, but I don't want them to be dependent upon me. And then I move on. Why do I do this? Because there are so many places that I ought to go where people need the inspiration to get something done, but they don't need me to be there monitoring it and being on top of it. And the problem with this is I did a seminar like this for it was about 2-3 days in the Midwest United States, and it was a rather large mission society. And they had all the area representatives from all parts of the world came together. And so we were spending several days talking about dependency issues, and one of the men raised his hand and said, I don't know what to do. What should I do to inspire local leaders to become self-reliant? That's a big question. I mean, I got 400 pages and I haven't dealt with all the issues related to it. So I said to him, and I'm on the spur of the moment now, I'm supposed to say something, bright, but so I said to him, well, how many of you travel to the areas of the world for which you are responsible? Oh, almost all the hands went up because they were the area directors, one for Africa, another for the Middle East, another for South Asia, another for East Asia, and so on. So I said, how many of you travel to those places? These hands went up. I said, how many of you attend business meetings of the church when you go there? Almost all the hands go up. And so I said, well, there's your problem right there. You're going to business meetings. They said, what? That's why we go there. I said, well, if you want to precipitate self-reliance among the people where you go to visit, among the church leaders, why don't you try going there without attending any business meetings? Yeah, but that's why we go. I said, well, okay, isn't it those business meetings where the budget is brought out and you discuss what your portion of it will be? Yes, that's right. I said, well, if you want to send a message about self-reliance, why don't you just decline the invitation to go to that meeting? Oh, no, but they can become defensive about that. And I said, no, if you really want them to take responsibility, just absent yourself from the meeting. Why do I say that? Because we had one church leader who said to us, he said to me one day, he said, Glenn, if we have an African group of African church leaders together, if there's one white man in the room, when we're having a discussion, we will vote the way he wants us to vote, even if he doesn't say anything. Now, why did he say that? because the person representing the power of money is there, and you're not going to say anything which discourages him from sending you more money. So I said, why don't you decline the invitation to attend the meeting? And they'll say to you, but don't you care? And you're going to say, yes, I care so much that I want you to stand on your own 2 feet so that you're not dependent on me. That's how much I care. So what are you going to do? And if you don't come to that meeting, what are you going to do? No, you tell them that you haven't been there for a while and there are some elderly people down in a village that you'd like to meet, or you'd like to do some hospital visitation or something like that. You go ahead and have your meeting. Let me tell you something. That kind of thinking is what will precipitate a change when maybe nothing else is working very well. And I've noticed over the years that it's not unusual for it to take a period of a year or two for the message to get through. And I can remember one mission group in Zimbabwe that had white missionaries from South Africa came into Zimbabwe and planted churches. They were planting 2 churches every year. And then the white missionaries from South Africa decided it was time to turn the work over and to leave. So they did. They turned the work over, went back to South Africa. Well, the church planting stopped. They weren't planting 2 churches a year anymore. None were being planted. But about 2 years after those missionaries left, one of the church leaders said, why don't we plant churches the way we used to when the missionaries were here? So they decided they can do it. So they began a church planting scheme, and they started planting 8 churches a year. Now, what happened in that 2-year period from the time the missionaries left until someone said, why don't we do it? I maintain that during that period, psychological ownership was preparing to change. And if you'd come back from South Africa and stepped in and brought all the reminders of what we used to do and the funding that we used to provide and all of that, you could have actually given the movement a setback. But the fact that they gave breathing space for the church, it shows to me that sometimes just stepping out of the picture willfully and saying, I don't want to interfere with your... All of a sudden, people will say, what? You really believe this thing that you're talking about? Yeah, I believe it. And the extent to which I believe it includes me declining the invitation to be there. I can fellowship with you, but don't expect me to be present when you do business. Okay, who's next?
One last quick question. Anybody?
Okay. Glenn, I think we really appreciate the time that you've spent with us. This has been extremely interesting, and you obviously have a great passion for this area, and I think my impression is that a lot of what you said really resonates with me, and I think a lot of what you said is just sort of right where we're at Global Health Ministries. And we will entertain some opportunity for discussion amongst board members at a later time as well. So, and might I ask that if the board members want to contact you directly with questions or to discuss, that they might be able to do that? And you got your contact information right on the PowerPoint.
Absolutely. Now, here's what I suggest. If at all possible, get a hold of my book and read it, and then you'll see the train of thought which I tried to put out here today. But if you read my book first, it will help us to have better conversations. Otherwise, I may have to start at the beginning. So I would encourage you to do that. Okay, now can I do something for just for a little bit of humor here? Um, I want to show you. Are you still seeing my screen?
Yes, uh-huh.
Okay. I have this thing about on short-term missions, and I have a whole chapter in my book on maximizing the benefits of short-term missions. And I'm saying be careful about the motivation for a short-term mission trip. And I found this in a bulletin, a church bulletin. Our congregation is sponsoring a women's-only mission trip to beautiful Guadalajara, Mexico. We'll spend the week of June 11 to 18 in Guadalajara, also known as the shopping capital of Mexico, where we will have the incredible opportunity to pray, to minister to, pray for, and teach women in a vibrant church community. And this isn't a rough roach in your bed kind of experience either. We'll be housed in nice, clean hotel rooms, eat lots of salsa, and have plenty of time to shop. Our hope is to take at least 15 women, including teenage daughters, on this Mexican ministry outreach. We trust that God will expand our hearts for Him as He expands our ministry to the women of Guadalajara. If you're remotely interested in this Great Commission adventure, or if you're just in the mood for Mexico after all this winter weather, call for more details about this fantastic outreach opportunity. Now, none of your churches would have had this notice. All right, well, thank you very much. I really enjoyed being with you. The only thing better than what we've done here, in my estimation, is if I could see you face to face, because I think there's something to be gained from face-to-face interaction. But and thanks to Scott for setting this up and making it work. I do appreciate it. All right. Okay, Karen, we'll be in.